A chilling wind rattles the windows of Greystone Lodge, where a ghostly figure is said to roam the halls, whispering secrets of a long-forgotten crime. A Miss Marple, the sharp-witted sleuth, steps into the mystery will she unravel the truth before the ghost strikes again. Chapter 1. Arrival at the lodge. The rain was coming down in sheets, hammering against the old taxi's roof as it wound its way up the narrow, twisting road to Greystone Lodge. Miss Jane Marple sat in the back, her knitting needles clicking softly, her sharp eyes peering through the fogged-up window. The village of St. Mary Mead was far behind her now. She was on her way to a place she'd only heard about in hushed whispers. Grand. Crumbling estate perched on a lonely hill, rumored to be haunted. The invitation had come unexpectedly. A letter from an old friend, Lady Eleanor Grayson, begging for her help. Something was wrong at the lodge, something sinister. And Eleanor's cryptic words hinted at a mystery that needed solving. Miss Marple, never one to shy away from a puzzle, had packed her bag and set off at once. The taxi lurched to a stop, and the driver, a gruff man with a thick scarf, muttered, "This is it, ma'am. Greystone Lodge. Mind yourself up there." Miss Marple smiled politely, tipped him, and stepped out into the storm, her sensible shoes sinking slightly into the muddy path. As she approached the looming iron gates, the lodge came into view. Massive gray stone building with ivy crawling up its walls like skeletal fingers. The windows glowed faintly, but there was no warmth in the light. It felt like the house was watching her, waiting. Miss Marple adjusted her hat, undeterred. She'd faced mysteries before, murders, thefts, betrayals, and she knew that even the darkest secrets couldn't hide from a keen mind. The gates creaked as she pushed them open, and a chill ran down her spine. Not from the cold, but from the strange feeling that she wasn't alone. A shadow flickered in the corner of her eye, gone before she could focus. "Nonsense," she murmured to herself, gripping her umbrella tighter. But deep down, she knew this was no ordinary visit. Greystone Lodge held secrets, and she was determined to uncover them. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old wood and damp. Lady Eleanor greeted her in the grand foyer, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly as she clasped Miss Marple's. "Oh, Jane, thank you for coming," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know who else to turn to." Eleanor was a tall woman, elegant even in her distress, but her eyes darted nervously toward the shadowed corners of the room. She led Miss Marple to a sitting room where a fire crackled weakly, casting long shadows on the walls. Over tea, Eleanor explained why she'd called. Strange things had been happening at the lodge doors, slamming in the night, whispers echoing through empty halls, and sightings of a ghostly figure in a white gown. The staff were terrified, and even Eleanor's nephew Charles, a skeptical young man, had started to question his own senses. Worst of all, a valuable family heirloom, a sapphire brooch, had vanished from a locked room. "It's not just the ghost, Jane," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "I think someone or something is trying to drive us out." Miss Marple listened carefully, her mind already turning over the details. A ghost, a missing brooch, and a house full of frightened people. It was a puzzle, and she loved puzzles. She asked Eleanor to describe the ghost. "It's a woman," Eleanor said, shivering. "Pale, with dark eyes, always in the same white dress. She appears in the east wing, near the old library." Miss Marple nodded, her expression calm, but her thoughts racing. Ghosts, in her experience, were often less supernatural than people believed. More likely, someone was using the legend to cover up something else: greed, revenge, or perhaps something darker. She decided to start her investigation that very night, beginning with the east wing. "Don't worry, Eleanor," she said, patting her friend's hand. "We'll get to the bottom of this." As night fell, Miss Marple made her way to the east wing, a flashlight in one hand and her knitting bag slung over her shoulder. The lodge was eerily quiet, the only sounds the creak of floorboards and the distant howl of the wind. The east wing was colder than the rest of the house, the air heavy with a strange, oppressive feeling. She moved slowly, her eyes scanning, Every detail, the faded portraits on the walls, the dusty rugs, the locked door to the old library. Suddenly a faint sound caught her attention, like the rustle of fabric. She turned, but no one was there. Her heart beat a little faster, but she steadied herself. "Imagination," she whispered, though she wasn't entirely convinced. Then, at the end of the hall, she saw a flicker of white, like a dress disappearing around a corner. Miss Marple's lips tightened. Ghost or not, something was afoot, and she was going to find out what before heading back to her room. She stopped by the library door, noting the heavy lock and the faint scratches around it. Someone had been here, and not long ago. She made a mental note to ask Eleanor about the history of the lodge and its former occupants. Every house like this had stories, and stories often held the key to the truth. As she returned to the main house, the storm outside grew fiercer, lightning illuminating the grim stone walls. Miss Marple felt a spark of excitement. This was just the beginning, and she was ready to dig deeper. The first chapter of our tale sets the stage for a classic mystery, with Miss Marple stepping into a world of shadows and secrets. What's behind the ghostly figure at Greystone Lodge? Is it a restless spirit, or something far more human? Stick with us as we follow Miss Marple's sharp mind through the twists and turns of this chilling case. Chapter 2. The history of the lodge. Miss Marple woke early the next morning, the storm having settled into a gray drizzle that draped Greystone Lodge in a somber mist. She sat at the breakfast table, a cup of tea steaming beside her, her notebook open to a fresh page. The events of the previous night, the rustle of fabric, the flicker of white, lingered in her mind. To solve a mystery, one needed to understand the past. In Greystone Lodge, its creaking floors and shadowed corners, was practically begging to tell its story. She'd asked Lady Eleanor to join her after breakfast to discuss the lodge's history, hoping to uncover clues about the ghostly figure and the missing sapphire brooch. As she sipped her tea, she noticed the dining room's faded grandeur-tarnished silver candelabras, a chandelier missing half its crystals, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors staring down from the walls. This place had seen better days, and Miss Marple suspected its decline was tied to more than just time. Lady Eleanor arrived, looking slightly more composed than the night before, though her eyes still held a flicker of unease. She carried a leather-bound book, its edges worn and yellowed. "This is the family chronicle," she explained, setting it on the table. "It documents the Graysons and the lodge, going back over a century." Miss Marple's fingers itched to turn the pages, but she let Eleanor guide her through the story. The lodge had been built in 1840 by Sir Henry Grayson, a wealthy merchant with a taste for extravagance. The family prospered for decades, hosting lavish parties and amassing treasures, including the sapphire brooch, a gift from a distant royal cousin. But in 1895, tragedy struck. Sir Henry's daughter Clara vanished on the eve of her wedding. She was last seen in the East Wing, wearing a white gown, and rumors spread that she'd been jilted by her fiancé and took her own life. "That's when the ghost stories began," Eleanor said, her voice low. "People say Clara's spirit haunts the lodge, searching for her lost love or her lost brooch." Miss Marple listened intently, her mind cataloging details. A missing woman, a valuable heirloom, and a ghost in a white gown. It was too neat. Too much like a story someone wanted believed. She asked Eleanor about Clara's fiancé. "His name was Edward Vaughan," Eleanor replied. "A charming man by all accounts, but he left the village after Clara disappeared. Some say he was heartbroken, others think he had something to hide." Miss Marple made a note to investigate the Vaughan family later. She then turned to the chronicle, flipping through its brittle pages. Sketches of the lodge showed the East Wing as it once was, a bustling area with guest rooms and a grand library. One entry caught her eye, a mention of a hidden room behind. The library used to store valuables during troubled times. "Is that room still there?" she asked. Eleanor frowned. "I don't know. The library's been locked for years. We assumed it was just storage." The conversation was interrupted by Charles, Eleanor's nephew, who strode into the room with a skeptical smirk. He was a tall, wiry man in his 30s, with sharp features and a habit of tapping his foot impatiently.
Hi.
Talking about the ghost? Again, Aunt Eleanor, he said, pouring himself coffee. It's all nonsense. It's probably just the wind and some overactive imaginations. Miss Marple studied him quietly. His dismissal was too quick, too practiced, and she wondered if he was trying to convince himself as much as his aunt. She asked if he'd seen anything unusual. Charles hesitated, then admitted he'd heard footsteps in the east wing late at night, but I'm not saying it's a ghost, he added quickly. Could be rats, or one of the staff sneaking around. Miss Marple smiled politely. Rats didn't wear white gowns, but she kept that thought to herself. After breakfast, Miss Marple decided to explore the lodge's grounds, hoping the fresh air might spark new ideas. The gardens were overgrown, with thorny roses tangling around rusted benches. She found an old gardener, Mr. Timmins, clipping hedges with arthritic hands. He'd worked at the lodge for 40 years and was happy to share stories. Clara's ghost? Oh, I've seen her, he said, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Late at night, near the east wing, always near that old oak by the library window. Miss Marple glanced at the tree, its gnarled branches scraping the lodge's walls. She noticed scuff marks in the dirt beneath it, too fresh to be from years past. Someone had been here recently, perhaps climbing to the library window. She thanked Mr. Timmins and made a mental note to check the window later. Back inside, Miss Marple spent the afternoon in the sitting room, poring over the family chronicle. She found references to Clara's brooch, described as a star-shaped sapphire surrounded by diamonds. It was said to be cursed, bringing misfortune to anyone who tried to sell it. Superstition, Miss Marple muttered, but she couldn't ignore the coincidence of its disappearance now, when the lodge was already steeped in fear. She also found a letter tucked into the chronicle, written in Clara's hand. It was addressed to Edward Vaughan, pleading with him to meet her in the library the night she vanished. The letter was unfinished, ending mid-sentence. If you don't come, I fear. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. Clara had been afraid, but of what or whom? As the day faded into evening, Miss Marple felt she was beginning to piece together the puzzle. The lodge's history was a tapestry of love, loss, and secrets, and Clara's story was at its heart. But was the ghost really Clara, or was someone using her legend to stir trouble? The hidden room behind the library intrigued her most. It could hold answers about the brooch or Clara's fate. She decided to investigate it the next day, but first, she needed to talk to the staff. Servants, she knew, often saw things others missed. For now, she closed the chronicle and stood, her mind buzzing with possibilities. The lodge was whispering its secrets, and she was listening. This chapter has peeled back the layers of Greystone. Lodge's past, revealing a tragic tale that might hold the key to the mystery. What secrets lie in the hidden room, and who else knows about it? Stay tuned as Miss Marple digs deeper into the shadows of this haunted estate. Chapter 3. The servant's secrets. The morning sun struggled to pierce the heavy clouds hanging over Greystone Lodge, casting a muted glow through the tall, dusty windows of the servants' quarters. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, had chosen this quiet hour to seek out the staff. Knowing that those who worked behind the scenes often held the keys to a household's mysteries, she carried a small basket of biscuits, her own recipe, a subtle bribe to loosen tongues, and wore her most disarming smile, the one that made people forget how sharp her mind truly was. The servants' area was tucked away at the back of the lodge, a maze of narrow corridors smelling of polish and stale bread. As she knocked on the kitchen door, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of the chase. The ghostly figure, the missing brooch, and the whispers of Clara Greyson's tragedy were all pieces of a puzzle, and she was certain the staff had seen, or heard something that could nudge her closer to the truth. Mrs. Baxter. The cook answered the door, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. She was a stout woman with a ruddy face and eyes that darted nervously, as if she expected trouble at any moment. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice a mix of surprise and wariness. "Didn't expect you down here," Miss Marple offered the biscuits and asked if she could have a word with the staff. Mrs. Baxter hesitated, then nodded, ushering her into the kitchen where a young maid, Lily, was peeling potatoes. And an older footman, Mr. Dobbs, sat polishing silver. The air was warm from the stove, but there was a tension that made the room feel colder than it was. Miss Marple settled at the worn wooden table. Her posture relaxed, but her eyes missing nothing, the way Lily's hands shook slightly, the way Dobbs avoided her gaze, the way Mrs. Baxter kept glancing toward the door. She began with small talk, asking about their duties and complimenting the biscuits' reception. "You must see so much working in a place like this," she said lightly, as if merely curious. "Old houses have such stories." Mrs. Baxter thought a little, admitting the lodge was full of creaks and odd noises. Lily, barely 18, piped up before catching herself. "I've heard things," she said, then blushed and focused on her potatoes. Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone gentle but probing. "What sort of things, dear?" Lily glanced at Mrs. Baxter, who gave a reluctant nod. "Whispers," Lily said softly. "Late at night, in the East Wing. Like someone's talking, but you can't make out the words." Dobbs snorted, setting down a spoon with a clink. "Girl's got an imagination," he muttered. But Miss Marple noticed his knuckles whitening around the polishing cloth. Pressing gently, she asked if any of them had seen the ghostly figure in white. Mrs. Baxter crossed herself, murmuring about poor Miss Clara, but claimed she'd never seen anything herself. Lily, however, hesitated, then admitted she'd glimpsed a white shape near the library window one night, while fetching water from the courtyard. "It moved so fast, like it floated," she said, her voice trembling. "I ran back inside and didn't look again." Dobbs rolled his eyes but said nothing, and Miss Marple made a mental note of his silence. Asked about the sapphire brooch, wondering if they'd heard anything about its disappearance. Mrs. Baxter shook her head firmly. "That's Lady Eleanor's business, not ours." But Lily's eyes flicked to Dobbs, a fleeting look that Miss Marple caught. There was something unspoken here, a thread she needed to pull to shift the mood. Miss Marple asked about their time at the lodge. Mrs. Baxter had been there 20 years. Dobbs nearly 30, but Lily was new, hired only 6 months ago. "It's a hard place to work," Lily admitted. "The others before me, they didn't stay long." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, filing away the turnover of staff as another clue. She then steered the conversation to the East Wing, mentioning the hidden room from the family chronicle. Mrs. Baxter's face tightened. "That old library's been locked since I came here," she said. "No one goes in, not even to clean," Dobbs added gruffly. "It's just dust and old books, nothing worth bothering about." But Miss Marple sensed he was holding back. She thanked them for their time, leaving the biscuits and promising to stop by again as she left the kitchen. Miss Marple decided to speak with the other staff members individually. She found Rose, the housemaid, dusting in the main hall.
Rose
Was older, with a pinched face and a nervous habit of twisting her apron. She was more forthcoming than the others, perhaps because she worked alone most of the day. "I don't believe in ghosts," she said firmly, "but I've seen lights in the East Wing at night, flickering like a candle. And once, I found the library door ajar, though it's supposed to be locked." Miss Marple's interest piqued. An open door suggested someone had accessed someone with a key or a skill with locks. She asked if Rose had noticed anything else unusual. "Mr. Charles," Rose said hesitantly. "He's been in the East Wing more than he lets on. Says he's checking the pipes, but he's no handyman." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind turning over Charles's dismissive attitude from the previous day. Was he hiding something? Later, Miss Marple sat in her room, jotting notes in her notebook. The staff's stories painted a picture of a house alive with secrets, whispers, lights, an open library door, and Charles's unexplained wanderings. She suspected the ghost was no spirit, but a cover for something tangible, perhaps tied to the brooch's theft. The hidden room behind the library was her next target, but she'd need to be clever about it. The lodge's keys were kept in Lady Eleanor's study, and Miss Marple wasn't above a bit of discreet snooping. For now, she decided to observe the household at dinner, where tensions might surface. As she closed her notebook, a faint creak echoed from the hallway outside. Her door. She froze, listening, but heard nothing more. Still, the sound reminded her that Greystone Lodge was watching, and someone or something was watching her back. This chapter has pulled us deeper into the lodge's web, where the staff's half-truths and nervous glances hint at hidden motives. Who's sneaking into the East Wing, and what are they after? Join Miss Marple as she takes her next step toward unraveling the mystery. Chapter 4. The Locked Library. The afternoon light filtered weakly through the heavy drapes of Greystone Lodge, casting long, wavering shadows across the polished floors. Miss Jane Marple stood in the main hall, her knitting bag slung over her shoulder, her eyes fixed on the corridor leading to the East Wing. The locked library door was calling to her, its secrets tugging at her curiosity like a loose thread in a sweater. She'd spent the morning mulling over the servants' stories, Lily's glimpse of a white figure, Rose's mention of flickering lights, and Dobbs's cagey silence. The hidden room behind the library, mentioned in the family chronicle, felt like the heart of the mystery, and Miss Marple was determined to get inside. But first, she needed the key, and that meant a visit to Lady Eleanor's study. She moved quietly through the house, her sensible shoes making no sound on the worn rugs, her mind sharp and focused. Every step brought her closer to the truth. But she knew she had to tread carefully. Someone in the lodge was watching, and they didn't want their secrets exposed. Lady Eleanor's study was on the second floor, a small room cluttered with books, papers, and faded photographs. Miss Marple knocked softly, then entered when Eleanor called out. Her friend was at a mahogany desk, sorting through letters, her face drawn with worry. "Jane, you're up and about early," Eleanor said, managing a weak smile. Miss Marple returned the smile, keeping her tone light. "I thought I'd take a look at the library, if you don't mind. Bit of history might shed light on things." Eleanor hesitated, her fingers tightening around a pen. "The library? It's been locked for years." "I'm not sure where the key is." Miss Marple nodded, noting the unease in Eleanor's voice. She didn't press yet, but asked if she could look through the study for old records. Eleanor agreed. Distracted by her papers, and Miss Marple began her search, her eyes scanning the desk and shelves for anything resembling a key, as she rifled through a drawer. Pretending to examine a ledger, she spotted a small brass key tucked beneath a pile of envelopes. It was old, tarnished, with a tag reading East Wing. Her heart quickened, but she kept her expression neutral, slipping the key into her pocket while chatting about the weather. Eleanor seemed oblivious, lost in her own thoughts, and Miss Marple excused herself, promising to return for tea. Made her way to the East Wing, the key heavy in her pocket, her mind racing with possibilities. The library door was her goal, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. A faint creak from the stairs made her pause, but when she turned, the hall was empty. "Nerves," she muttered, though she didn't quite believe it. Greystone Lodge had a way of making even the steadiest soul feel uneasy. The East Wing was colder than the rest of the house, the air thick with dust and something less tangible, a sense of secrets long buried. The library door loomed at the end of the corridor, its heavy oak surface scarred with age. Miss Marple glanced around, ensuring she was alone, then slid the key into the lock. It turned with a reluctant groan, as if the door itself resented being disturbed. Inside, the library was a cavern of shadows, its high shelves crammed with leather-bound books, their spines cracked and faded. A musty smell filled the air, mingled with a faint hint of something sharper, lamp oil, perhaps. Miss Marple's flashlight beam danced across the room, revealing a large desk, a cracked leather armchair, and a portrait of a young woman in a white gown. Clara Grayson, she guessed, her dark eyes staring out with an expression of quiet desperation. The painting sent a shiver down Miss Marple's spine, but she pushed it aside. Sentiment wouldn't solve this mystery. She moved to the back wall, where the chronicle had described a hidden room. Running her hands along the paneling, she felt for anything unusual, a seam, a latch, a hollow spot. Her fingers caught on a slight ridge, and with a gentle push, a section of the wall clicked and swung inward, revealing a narrow, dark space. Her pulse quickened as she stepped inside, the air even colder here, heavy with the scent of old paper and something metallic. The hidden room was small, barely 10 feet square, with a single shelf holding a few dusty ledgers and a locked wooden box. Miss Marple examined the box, noting fresh scratches around the lock. Someone had tried to force it open, and recently? She didn't have the tools to pick the lock, but she made a mental note to return with something suitable. For now, she turned to the ledgers, flipping through brittle pages filled with accounts of the Grayson family's finances. One entry, dated 1895, caught her eye. A payment to Edward Vaughn, Clara's fiancé, for services rendered. The amount was substantial, and the vagueness of the description raised her suspicions. Had Edward been paid off, or was it something else entirely? As she closed the ledger, a soft thud echoed from the main library. Miss Marple froze, her flashlight dimming for a moment before flickering back on. She stepped out of the hidden room, closing the panel behind her, and scanned the library. A book lay on the floor, fallen from a shelf. She picked it up, a volume of poetry open to a page marked with a faded ribbon. The poem was about lost love, and a handwritten note in the margin read, "Forgive me, see." Her mind raced. Clara? Or someone else? Before she could ponder further, footsteps approached, quick, purposeful steps. She slipped the book into her knitting bag and moved to the desk, pretending to examine a paperweight as Charles appeared. In the doorway, his face flushed. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Miss Marple smiled calmly. "Just indulging my love of old books," she said. "This library is quite a treasure." Charles's eyes narrowed, but he didn't press. "It's not safe to wander alone," he said gruffly. "The floors are uneven." She nodded, sensing his unease, and let him escort her out. The key still safe in her pocket. Back in her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, her notebook open. The hidden room, the scratched box, the payment to Edward. The note in the poetry book, it all pointed to a story far more complex than a simple ghost. Charles's sudden appearance in the library was no coincidence. He knew more than he was letting on. She decided to keep an eye on him, perhaps even follow him if he ventured to the East Wing again. For now, she needed to learn more about Edward Vaughn and his connection to Clara. The village records might hold answers, and a trip to the local church, where old families often left traces, was in order. As she closed her notebook, a gust of wind rattled the window, and for a moment she thought she saw a flicker of white outside. Her lips tightened. Ghost or not, someone was playing a dangerous game. Miss Marple was determined to win. This chapter has taken us into the heart of the lodge's secrets, where locked doors and hidden rooms whisper of betrayal and lost love. What's in that locked box, and why is Charles so nervous? Stay with Miss Marple as she follows the trail to the village, where the past might hold the key to the present. Chapter 5. The village whispers. The morning air was crisp as Miss Jane Marple stepped out of Greystone Lodge, her sturdy umbrella doubling as a walking stick as she navigated the uneven path to the village of Greystone Hollow. The drizzle had stopped, leaving the world damp and glistening. But the sky remained heavy with clouds, as if reluctant to let the sun break through. She wore her favorite tweed coat, a scarf tucked neatly around her neck, and her knitting bag slung over her shoulder, its contents a comforting weight. The lodge's secrets, the hidden room, the scratched box. The cryptic note in the poetry book had stirred her curiosity, but she knew the answers might lie beyond its walls. Villages, she'd learned from years in St. Mary Mead, were treasure. Troves of gossip and half-remembered truths, and Greystone Hollow was no exception. She aimed to visit the church, where records of births, deaths, and marriages might shed light on Clara Grayson and Edward Vaughn, and perhaps uncover why their story still haunted the lodge. The walk to the village was a mile downhill, through fields of wet grass and past gnarled trees that seemed to lean in as if eavesdropping. Miss Marple's sharp eyes took in every detail: the hoof prints of a horse in the mud, a broken fence post, a scrap of white cloth caught on a thorn bush. She paused to examine the cloth, noting its fine weave, too delicate for a servant's garment. Tucking it into her bag, she continued, her mind turning over the puzzle. The village came into view, a cluster of stone cottages huddled around a cobbled square, with a small church at its heart. The Greystone Hollow Church was ancient, its steeple weathered but proud, its graveyard a patchwork of moss-covered stones. Miss Marple felt a pang of familiarity. Churches like this were keepers of secrets. She was adept at coaxing them out. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of wax and old hymnals. The vicar, Reverend Thomas, was a wiry man with spectacles perched on his nose, sorting him sheets. In the vestry, he greeted her warmly, intrigued by a visitor from St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple explained she was a guest at the lodge and curious about its history, particularly the Grayson family. The vicar's face lit up. He loved a good tale. "Oh, the Graysons," he said, leading her to a cluttered office. "They've been part of this village for centuries. It's a tragic lot, though, especially Clara." He pulled out a heavy ledger. Its pages yellowed but meticulously kept. As he flipped through, Miss Marple asked about Clara's disappearance in 1895. The vicar nodded gravely. "A sad story. Clara was to marry Edward Vaughan, a dashing fellow from a merchant family. But the night before the wedding, she vanished. No body was ever found, but the village whispered she'd drowned herself in the lake behind the lodge. Others said Edward spirited her away or worse." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes bright. "Worse." The vicar lowered his voice, as if the walls might overhear. "Some thought Edward had a hand in it. He was seen arguing with Clara that day near the east wing. After she vanished, he left the village within a week, never to return. The Graysons paid for a memorial stone in the graveyard, but it's always felt incomplete." Miss Marple asked to see the stone, and the vicar led her outside to a quiet corner of the graveyard. Clara's memorial was a simple slab, engraved with her name and the words "lost to us, but not forgotten." Moss had crept over the edges, but the stone looked recently cleaned, as if someone still cared. Miss Marple noted a wilted rose, tucked into the grass nearby, its petals fresh enough to suggest a recent visitor. "Does anyone tend to this?" she asked. The vicar shrugged. "Not that I've seen, but flowers appear now and then. Could be a villager, or someone from the lodge." Back in the vestry, Miss Marple pored over the ledger, her fingers tracing entries from 1895. She found Clara's birth record, confirming she was 22 when she disappeared, and a marriage license for her and Edward never used. There was also a curious entry, a baptism for a child, unnamed, born to a Grayson's servant in 1896, a year after Clara's disappearance. The father was listed as unknown, but the mother, a maid named Margaret, had left the village soon. After, Miss Marple's mind raced. Could Margaret's child be connected to Clara's story? She asked the vicar about Margaret, but he knew little, only that she'd worked at the lodge and was dismissed shortly after Clara vanished. The Graysons were private about their affairs, he said, but the village never forgot. Some say Clara's ghost still walks, seeking justice. Leaving the church, Miss Marple decided to visit the village pub, a rusty anchor where locals might share looser tongues. The pub was cozy, with low beams and a fire crackling in the hearth. She ordered a pot of tea and settled near a group of older men nursing pints. With her unassuming air, she struck up a conversation, mentioning the lodge and its ghost. The men were eager to talk. "Clara's ghost," said one, a grizzled farmer named Tom. "My gran saw her once, drifting by the lake. White dress, sad eyes." Another, a retired postman, scoffed. "It's not Clara. It's someone playing tricks. Back in my day, we saw lights in the lodge's east wing, long after it was locked up. Smugglers, maybe, or thieves." Miss Marple listened, her tea cooling as she absorbed their stories. One detail stood out. A villager had seen a man resembling Edward Vaughan near the lodge a decade ago, long after he was supposed to have left for good. "Looked like a ghost himself," the man said, pale, skulking about the east wing. She left the pub. Miss Marple's mind buzzed with new threads. The fresh rose on Clara's grave, the mysterious child. The sighting of Edward years later, it all suggested the past was very much alive. She stopped by the village shop to buy a postcard, a habit from her travels, and overheard the shopkeeper gossiping with a customer about Charles Grayson. "He's been asking about old records at the town hall," the shopkeeper said. "Something about property lines. Odd for a man who claims he hates the lodge." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Charles's interest in records was no coincidence. He was searching for something, perhaps the same thing she was, back at the lodge. Miss Marple sat in her room, her notebook filling with scribbled connections. The village had given her pieces of the puzzle, but they didn't yet fit. Clara's disappearance, Edward's argument, the servant's child, the brooch's theft, all were linked. She was sure, but how? The white cloth from the thorn bush nagged at her. It was too fine for a servant, too modern for a ghost. She decided her next move was to confront Charles about his wanderings and his interest in records. But first, she'd return to the hidden room with tools to open that locked box. As night fell, she heard a faint tapping like fingers on glass coming from her window. She peered out but saw only darkness. Her heart beat faster, but she steadied herself. The village had whispered its secrets, and now it was time to make the lodge talk. This chapter has drawn us into the village's tales, where old wounds and new suspicions intertwine. What is Charles searching for, and who left that rose on Clara's grave? Follow Miss Marple as she returns to the lodge, ready to confront the shadows head-on. Chapter 6. Confronting Shadows. The evening at Greystone Lodge was heavy with the promise of another storm. The air thick and restless as Miss Jane Marple sat in the dining room, eyes quietly observing the flicker of candlelight on the polished table. Dinner was a strained affair, with Lady Eleanor picking at her food and Charles nursing a glass of wine, his usual bravado replaced by a distracted frown. Miss Marple had decided tonight was the time to probe Charles's activities, armed with the village's whispers about his inquiries at the town hall and Rose's claim of his late-night wanderings in the East Wing. Her knitting needles clicked softly in her lap, a soothing rhythm that belied the sharp calculations in her mind. Oh, the white cloth from the thorn bush, the locked box in the hidden room, and the village's tales of Clara and Edward were puzzle pieces, and Charles, she suspected, held a few of them. She needed to tread carefully to direct, and he'd clam up. It was subtle, and she'd learn nothing. As the dessert plates were cleared, Miss Marple seized her moment. "Charles," she began, her voice mild, "I hear you've been looking into old records at the town hall. Something about property lines?" Charles froze, his fork halfway to his mouth, and Eleanor glanced up, surprised. "Records," she echoed. Charles recovered quickly, setting down his fork with a forced laugh. "Just curiosity, Aunt Eleanor. The lodge is falling apart. Thought I'd check if we could sell off some land." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of polite interest. "I'd have thought you'd be more interested in the lodge's history, given all the talk of Clara's ghost." Charles's smile tightened, and she caught a flash of irritation in his eyes. "Ghosts are for storytellers," he said. "I'm more concerned with practical matters." But his fingers tapped nervously on the table, and Miss Marple knew she'd struck a nerve. She pressed gently, mentioning the village's stories about lights in the East Wing and the memorial stone for Clara, tended with fresh flowers. "Someone still cares about her," she said, watching Charles closely. His face remained impassive, but his tapping stopped abruptly. "People love their legends," he muttered, then excused himself, claiming a headache. Eleanor looked troubled, her hands twisting in her lap. "He's been so tense lately," she said softly. "I thought it was just the brooch's theft, but perhaps there's more." Miss Marple patted her hand, promising to keep an eye on things, but her mind was already elsewhere. Charles's evasiveness confirmed her suspicions he was involved in something perhaps tied to the hidden room or the brooch itself. Resolved to follow him if he slipped out that night. After dinner, Miss Marple retired to her room, but sleep was far from her mind. She changed into a dark dress, slipped a small screwdriver into her knitting bag for the locked box, and waited by her window, the curtains parted just enough to watch the courtyard. The lodge was quiet, save for the occasional groan of settling wood, but her patience was rewarded around midnight when she saw a figure tall, wiry, unmistakably Charles, moving toward the East Wing. She grabbed her bag and followed, her footsteps silent on the thick rugs. The East Wing was a labyrinth of shadows, the air colder than ever, and she kept her distance, using doorways and alcoves to stay hidden. Charles stopped at the library, door glancing around before pulling a key from his pocket. Miss Marple's breath caught. Had he found another key, or had he taken the one she'd returned to Eleanor's study? The door creaked open, and he slipped inside. She waited a moment, then followed, easing the door open just enough to peer in. Charles was at the back wall, fumbling with the panel to the hidden room. He didn't notice her as she stepped inside, her flashlight off to avoid detection. The panel clicked, and he disappeared into the hidden room. Miss Marple crept closer, her heart pounding but her resolve firm. Peering through the crack, she saw him kneeling by the locked box, a small crowbar. In hand, he pried at the lock, muttering under his breath, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, a sharp noise, a book falling from a shelf in the main library, made him freeze. Miss Marple ducked behind the desk, her pulse racing. Charles cursed softly, grabbed his crowbar, and hurried out, leaving the panel ajar. When she was sure he was gone, Miss Marple entered the hidden room, her screwdriver at the ready. The box's lock was stubborn, but years of living in St. Mary Mead had taught her a trick or two about old locks. After a few careful twists, the lid popped open, revealing a velvet lining and a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. Untied them, her fingers trembling slightly, and scanned the first letter. It was from Clara to Edward, dated the day before her disappearance, pleading with him to meet her in the library. "I know the truth about the brooch," it read, "and I cannot let it destroy us." The other letters were similar, filled with desperation and hints of a secret Clara feared would ruin her family. One mentioned a debt owed to a man named Silas, a name Miss Marple didn't recognize but noted carefully. There was no brooch in the box, but the letters were a goldmine, suggesting Clara had uncovered something dangerous. As she tucked the letters into her bag, a faint rustle came from the main library, a sound like fabric brushing against wood. Miss Marple froze, her flashlight sweeping the room, but saw nothing. Still, the air felt heavier, as if the lodge itself was holding its breath. She closed the box, slipped out of the hidden room, and secured the panel, her mind racing. Letters pointed to a motive. Perhaps Clara's disappearance wasn't suicide, but something orchestrated to silence her. And Charles's attempt to open the box suggested he knew more than he let on. Was he after the letters, the brooch, or both? She needed to learn about this Silas and his connection to the Greystons, but confronting Charles directly would have to wait. For now, she'd keep the letters hidden and watch him closely. Back in her room, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the letters spread before her. She reread them, noting Clara's fear and Edward's apparent refusal to help. The mention of a debt intrigued her. Could it be tied to the payment to Edward in the family chronicle? And what did Clara mean by the truth about the brooch? As she jotted notes, a distant thud echoed through the lodge, followed by silence. She glanced at the window, half expecting to see that flicker of white again, but the night was still. The lodge was closing in around her, its secrets growing. Heavier, but Miss Marple felt a spark of excitement. She was closing in too, and the truth was within reach. This chapter has plunged us deeper into the mystery, with Charles's nighttime prowling and Clara's desperate letters revealing a web of deceit. Who is Silas, and what truth did Clara uncover? Stay with Miss Marple as she unravels the next thread in this chilling tale. Chapter 7. The trail of Silas. The dawn broke over Greystone Lodge with a pale, watery light that did little to dispel the chill clinging to its stone walls. Miss Jane Marple sat at the small desk in her room, the bundle of Clara's letters spread before her, their words looping through her mind like a half-remembered tune. The mention of Silas, a name tied to a mysterious debt, had sparked her curiosity, and she was determined to uncover his identity. Her knitting lay untouched, her focus entirely on the puzzle at hand, the missing brooch, the ghostly figure, and now these letters hinting at a secret Clara had died to protect. She'd hidden the letters in her knitting bag tucked beneath a skein of wool, knowing they were too valuable to leave unguarded. Today, she planned to return to the village, seeking out anyone who might know of Silas. But first, she needed to gauge the household's mood after last night's events. Charles's attempt to break into the locked box suggested he was desperate. And desperation, in Miss Marple's experience, often led to mistakes. At breakfast, the dining room was quieter than usual. The clink of cutlery, sounding sharp against the tension. Lady Eleanor was pale, her eyes red-rimmed as if she hadn't slept, while Charles was absent, his chair empty. "He's gone to town," Eleanor said, when Miss Marple inquired, her voice brittle. "Something about business." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions deepening. Charles's sudden trip felt like an escape, perhaps from her probing questions, or the failure to open the box. She decided not to mention the letters, yet Eleanor was too fragile. Miss Marple needed more information before revealing her find. Instead, she asked about the lodge's staff from Clara's time, hoping to uncover a link to Silas. Eleanor frowned, struggling to recall. "There were so many back then," she said. "But I remember a gardener, Silas Thorne." He was dismissed. After Clara vanished, something about theft, I think. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. A gardener named Silas, tied to theft, could be the key. She excused herself after breakfast, claiming a need for fresh air, and set off for the village. Again, her umbrella tapping the ground as she walked. The path was muddier today, the recent rain turning the earth to sludge, but Miss Marple's determination kept her steady. Greystone Hollow was waking up, with smoke curling from chimneys and villagers hurrying about their tasks. She headed for the church first, hoping Reverend Thomas might know more about Silas Thorne. The vicar was in the graveyard, tending to a broken headstone, and greeted her with a smile. "Back so soon, Miss Marple," he said, brushing dirt from his hands. She explained her interest in Silas, keeping her tone casual, as if merely curious about village history. The vicar's face darkened. "Silas Thorne," he said, shaking his head. "A troubled man. Worked at the lodge for years, but he was let go in 1895. There were rumors he stole from the Greystone small things, silver spoons, a locket. Some said he was in love with Clara, but she never looked at him twice." Miss Marple's mind raced. Gardener in love with Clara dismissed. For theft, and tied to a debt in her letters, it was too much to be coincidence. She asked if Silas had stayed in the village. "No," the vicar said. "He left soon after, but his sister Agnes still lives here. She's old now, keeps to herself in a cottage by the mill." Miss Marple thanked him, her plan clear. Agnes Thorne might hold answers about her brother, and perhaps about Clara's fate. She found the cottage easily, a small, ivy-covered building with a sagging roof. Agnes was a frail woman with sharp eyes, her hands gnarled from years of work. She invited Miss Marple in reluctantly, offering weak tea in chipped cups. The cottage was sparse, with a single photograph on the mantel, a young man with a sullen expression, likely Silas. Miss Marple eased into the conversation. Mentioning her stay at the lodge and the old stories about Clara, Agnes's face hardened at the mention of her brother. "Silas didn't steal," she said fiercely. That place loved Clara, though she was too grand for him. The Graysons ruined him, blamed him for things he didn't do." Miss Marple listened, her expression sympathetic, but her mind sharp. Agnes revealed that Silas had been obsessed with the sapphire brooch, believing it was cursed and should be returned to its rightful owner. He'd argued with Clara about it, claiming it was tied to a family debt loan from a merchant that had bankrupted his own kin. After Clara vanished, Agnes said, her voice breaking, Silas went mad with grief. He swore she'd been killed to keep the brooch's secret. He left the village, but he wrote to me, saying he'd come back one day to prove it. This was a breakthrough. Miss Marple asked if Silas had ever returned. Agnes hesitated, then nodded. Once about 10 years ago. He was different, wild, sick-looking. Said he'd been to the lodge, seen things. Then he disappeared again. Haven't heard from him since. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the villager's story of a man resembling Edward Vaughan near the lodge a decade ago. Could it have been Silas, mistaken for someone else? She thanked Agnes, leaving her with a promise to share any news, and headed back to the village square, her mind buzzing. Silas's obsession with the brooch, his belief in a debt, and his return to the lodge suggested he might have been involved in Clara's disappearance, or at least knew more than he'd told. Before returning to the lodge, Miss Marple stopped. At the town hall, a small building with creaking floors and dusty archives. The clerk, a young woman with a bored expression, let her browse the old property records. She found a document from 1895, noting a transfer of a small parcel of lodge land to a merchant named Von Edward's father, perhaps. The transaction was marked as payment for a debt, corroborating Clara's letters. Had the brooch been part of that deal, or a point of contention? As she left the town hall, she noticed a figure watching her from across the square, Orrery. Wearing a dark coat, Charles. He turned away when she met his gaze, disappearing into an alley. Her lips tightened. He was following her, and that meant he was worried. Back at the lodge, Miss Marple sat by her window, her notebook filling with new connections. Silas Thorne, Clara's letters, the land deal, and Charles's suspicious behavior were weaving a tighter web. She suspected Silas had known something about the brooch's history, perhaps a secret worth killing for. Charles's interest in property records suggested he was digging into the same past. Maybe for profit, maybe for something darker. She decided to keep the letters hidden for now and watch for Charles's next move. A faint whisper seemed to drift through the room, like a voice calling from far away. She shook her head, dismissing it as the wind. But her instincts told her the lodge was growing restless. Time was running short. This chapter has followed Miss Marple into the village's shadows. Silas Thorne's story adds new layers to the mystery. Is Charles chasing the same truth or hiding his own? Stay tuned as Miss Marple edges closer to the heart of Greystone Lodge's secrets. Chapter 8. The storm's fury. The wind howled around Greystone Lodge like a chorus of tormented souls, rattling the windows and whipping the trees into a frenzy as a fierce storm rolled in from the hills. Miss Jane Marple stood by her bedroom window, watching the lightning carve jagged paths across the darkened sky, each flash illuminating the overgrown gardens below in stark, ghostly white. The rain pelted the glass in relentless sheets, mirroring the turmoil in her mind as she pieced together the fragments of the mystery that had consumed her days. Clara's desperate letters, Silas Thorne's obsession with the cursed brooch, the shadowy land deal with the Vaughns, and Charles's furtive behavior all swirled like leaves in the gale. She had spent the afternoon reviewing her notes, cross-referencing details from Agnes Thorne's account and the town hall records. And a picture was emerging, one of greed, unrequited love, and perhaps murder disguised as tragedy. But pictures could deceive, and Miss Marple knew she needed more than suspicions. She needed proof. Tonight, with the storm providing cover for any unusual noises, she planned to search Charles's room, hoping to find evidence of his involvement. Her knitting bag, now a repository of secrets with Clara's letters hidden inside, sat ready. By the door, a small flashlight tucked alongside the wool as the clock struck 9. The lodge groaned under the storm's assault, and Miss Marple slipped into the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the thunderous roar outside. The corridors were dimly lit by flickering sconces, casting elongated shadows that danced like phantoms on the walls. She paused at every creak, her senses heightened, aware that the house was alive with its own sounds, but also potentially with intruders or the so-called ghost. Charles had returned from the village earlier, his face stormy as the weather, and retired to his room without a word. Lady Eleanor had confided over tea that he seemed more agitated than ever, pacing and muttering about old debts that needed settling. Miss Marple had nodded sympathetically, but her mind had latched onto those words, debts, like the one Clara mentioned in her letters, tied to the brooch and the land. If Charles was aware of that history, he might be trying to exploit it, perhaps, by stealing the brooch to pay off modern debts or to claim some inheritance. She reached his door, listening for any sign of movement inside. Hearing only the rain, she tried the handle on. Careless mistake in a house full of mysteries. The room was modest. The four-poster bed, a wardrobe, and a desk cluttered with papers. Miss Marple closed the door softly behind her, her flashlight beam sweeping the space. She started with the desk, rifling through drawers filled with receipts, letters, and a small notebook. One receipt caught her eye from a jeweler in a nearby town, dated just a week ago, for an appraisal. Of antique sapphire jewelry, her heart skipped. The brooch. She pocketed the receipt, then flipped through the notebook, Scrawled entries detailed the lodge's finances, debts mounting, bills unpaid in. A cryptic note, Silas knows the truth. Find him before he ruins. Everything Miss Marple's breath caught. Charles knew about Silas. Had he been the one leaving flowers at Clara's grave, or searching for Silas's whereabouts? She moved to the wardrobe, her fingers brushing against coats and shirts, until she felt a hard object in a pocket, a small key, similar to the one for the library, but engraved with attic. The lodge had an attic. Eleanor hadn't mentioned it, but old houses like this often did. Hidden spaces for forgotten treasures or secrets. Before she could explore further, a floorboard creaked outside the door. Miss Marple switched off her flashlight and ducked behind the bed, her pulse racing as the door eased open. A figure entered, silhouetted by the hallway light. Charles, his wet coat dripping from the storm. He moved to the desk, rummaging frantically, muttering, "Where is it? It has to be here." Miss Marple held her breath, watching as he pulled out a folded map yellowed with age. It's marked with the lodge's grounds and a red X near the old oak by the east wing. He stuffed it into his pocket and left, the door clicking shut. She waited several minutes, then slipped out, her mind abuzz. The map suggested a buried secret, perhaps the brooch or evidence of Clara's fate. But why the attic key? She decided to investigate the attic first, before confronting Charles or following him outside. The storm was intensifying, thunder booming like cannon fire, providing perfect cover for her movements. The attic access was a narrow staircase at the end of the upper hall, concealed behind a tapestry. Miss Marple climbed carefully, the steps creaking under her weight, the air growing mustier with each rise. At the top, the key fit perfectly, unlocking a door that swung open with a puff of dust. The attic was a vast, cluttered space, beams arching overhead like ribs in a whale's belly. Boxes and trunks piled haphazardly under sloping eaves. Rain hammered the roof, creating a deafening rhythm, and lightning flashed through a small dormer window, illuminating the chaos. Miss Marple's flashlight revealed old furniture shrouded in sheets, cracked mirrors reflecting distorted images, and a trunk labeled Greystone heirlooms. She knelt before it, her screwdriver from the knitting bag, making quick work of the rusty lock. Inside were faded gowns, yellowed letters, and at the bottom, a small diary bound in leather. Clara's diary, her handwriting matched the letters. Miss Marple sat on a nearby crate, poring over the pages by flashlight. The entries detailed Clara's life, her love for Edward, her excitement about the wedding. But then a shift, discoveries about the brooch. Father stole it from the Thorns, one entry read. Silas confronted me, said it was his family's, taken to settle a false debt. Edward knows, but he won't help. I must return it, or the curse will claim us all. Later entries grew. Frantic. Silas threatens to expose everything. Met him in the library. He has proof. If Edward doesn't come, I'll face him alone. The last entry dated the night of her disappearance. The storm rages. Silas waits. I fear this is the end. Miss Marple closed the diary, her mind reeling. So Silas had met Clara that night, and the brooch was stolen property? That explained his obsession, Clara's fear, and perhaps her vanishing. Did Silas kill her to reclaim it, or was there an accident? And how did Charles fit in? He must have found clues leading him to Silas, perhaps seeing him as a threat to the family's claim on the lodge. A sudden crash of thunder shook the attic, and Miss Marple stood, tucking the diary into her bag. As she turned to leave, a gust of wind blew open the dormer window. Rain sprang in, and in the lightning's glare, she saw a figure in white, standing at the far end of the attic, its form ethereal and unmoving. Her heart leaped, but she steadied herself. Who's there? She called, her voice firm despite the storm. The figure shifted, and Miss Marple advanced, flashlight raised. It wasn't a ghost, it was Lily, the young maid, her white nightgown soaked, her face pale with fear. Miss Marple, she gasped. I followed you. I know about the attic. Mr. Charles made me help him search it. Miss Marple guided her to a dry spot, wrapping her in a sheet. Lily confessed. Charles had been paying her to spy, to report. on Miss Marple's movements and to stage ghostly appearances, rustling fabrics. Whispers through Vince to scare Eleanor into selling the lodge. He says there's treasure buried from Clara's time, Lily said, tears mixing with rain. He's digging tonight by the oak. Miss Marple's lips tightened. Charles was using the ghost legend to manipulate his aunt and Lily's involvement explained the sightings. But was he after the brooch or something else? She sent Lily back to her room with a promise of discretion, then descended the stairs, her resolve hardened. The storm was her ally now. She'd follow Charles to the oak and confront him. Outside, the rain lashed her face as she navigated the gardens, umbrella battling the wind. Lightning revealed Charles ahead, shovel in hand, digging furiously at the oak's base. Mud flew as he unearthed a small metal box, his laugh triumphant over the thunder. Miss Marple approached, her voice cutting through the gale. "Charles, what have you found?" he whirled, shock turning to defiance. "Stay back. This is mine, the brooch, the proof. Silas hid it here, but now it's Greystone property." Miss Marple shook her head. "It's stolen, Charles, and Clara died for it." The confrontation unfolded in the storm's fury. Charles, admitting he'd discovered Silas's letters hidden in the attic years ago, dado-dailing the brooch's theft. He'd tracked Silas down, but the man was dead, his secrets buried with the brooch. Charles had stolen it from Eleanor's room, hidden it, then lost it to fuel the ghost scare, planning to find it and sell the lodge for profit. But Miss Marple's probing had forced his hand. As lightning cracked, a shadowy figure emerged from the trees old. "Mr. Timmins," the gardener, his eyes wild. "You'll not have it," he shouted. "Silas was my uncle. The brooch is ours." Chaos ensued, Timmins lunging for the box, Charles shoving him, but Miss Marple intervened. Her umbrella, a makeshift barrier. "Enough. The truth is out. No more ghosts. No more lies." Back inside, as the storm subsided, Miss Marple gathered Eleanor, Charles, and the staff in the sitting room. She revealed everything: the brooch's stolen origins, Silas's confrontation with Clara, her likely accidental death in the struggle, perhaps falling from the library window, and Charles's scheme. The ghost was Lily, coerced but innocent. Timmins confessed to aiding Charles, driven by family loyalty. The brooch would be returned to Agnes, debts settled honorably. Eleanor, though heartbroken, thanked Miss Marple, and Charles, chastened, agreed to make amends. This chapter has stormed through revelations and confrontations, unveiling the tangled web of past and present at Greystone Lodge. With secrets laid bare, what final twists await? Join Miss Marple for the conclusion in our next chapter. Chapter 9. The pieces fall into place the morning after the storm broke over Greystone Lodge with a deceptive calm. The air heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine. Miss Jane Marple sat in the sitting room, a pot of tea steaming beside her, her knitting needles idle for once as she reviewed her notes. The events of the previous night, Charles's desperate digging, Mr. Timmins's confrontation, and the revelation of the brooch's stolen origins had brought the mystery into sharp focus, but there were still loose ends to tie. The sapphire brooch, now resting in the metal box on the table before her, gleamed faintly in the sunlight streaming through the window, a silent witness to a century of secrets. Clara's diary and letters, safely retrieved from her knitting bag, lay beside it, their pages worn but heavy with truth. Miss Marple knew the lodge still held one final secret: the exact circumstances of Clara's death. Was it truly an accident, as she'd suggested last night, or had Silas Thorne, in his obsession, crossed the line? What of Edward Vaughan's role? She needed to piece together the final fragments before presenting the full truth to Lady Eleanor. In the household, Miss Marple began her day by revisiting the east wing, drawn back to the library and its hidden room. The storm had left the lodge damp, the air in the east wing thick with mildew. But she moved with purpose, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. She wanted to examine the library window, the one near the old oak where Timmins had claimed Silas met Clara that fateful night. The window was tall, its frame warped, and the latch was loose, as if it had been forced open many times. Peering out, She saw the oak's gnarled roots below, now churned with mud from Charles's digging. The drop was steep 20 feet perhaps, and the ground beneath was rocky. Fall could easily have been fatal, especially in a storm like the one Clara's diary described. Miss Marple's lips pursed. An accident seemed plausible, but she needed evidence. She examined the window frame, noticing faint scratches on the sill like those on the locked box. Someone had climbed in or out. Perhaps Silas, perhaps Clara. Fleeing or being pushed, returning to the hidden room, Miss Marple searched for anything she might have missed. The dusty ledgers were as she'd left them, but a small, overlooked crack in the wall caught her eye. Prying gently with her screwdriver, she uncovered a hidden niche containing a single, crumpled letter. It was from Edward Vaughn to Clara, dated the morning of her disappearance. "I cannot meet you tonight," it read. Silas is dangerous and the brooch's curse is real. Leave it be, or we're all doomed." Miss Marple's heart sank. Edward had known of Silas's threats, but abandoned Clara to face him alone. The letter confirmed her suspicions. Clara had confronted Silas in the library, likely about the brooch's theft from his family. And the encounter had ended in tragedy, perhaps a struggle, a push, a fall through the window. Silas, consumed by guilt or fear, had hidden the brooch and fled. Leaving the Greystons to craft the story of Clara's suicide, her next step was to speak with Mr. Timmins again. The gardener who'd revealed his connection to Silas. She found him in the garden shed, sharpening tools with a grim expression. He looked up warily as she approached, her umbrella tapping the ground like a metronome. "Mr. Timmins," she said gently, "I need the truth about your Uncle Silas, for Clara's sake." Timmins' shoulders sagged, and after a long pause, he spoke. Silas had loved Clara, he said, but was consumed by rage over the brooch, stolen by her father to settle a debt with the Vaughns. On the night of the storm, Silas had lured Clara to the library, demanding she return it. "Oh, he didn't mean to." "Hurt her," Timmins said, his voice cracking. They argued. She tried to leave through the window to escape him, and she slipped. Silas panicked, hid the brooch under the oak, and ran. Told me years later before he died. Kept his secret, but when Charles started digging, I had to act. Miss Marple nodded, her heart heavy, but her mind clear. Silas hadn't meant to kill Clara, but his actions had led to her death. The brooch's curse had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Back at the lodge, Miss Marple sought out Lily, the maid who'd been coerced into playing the ghost. Lily was in the kitchen, scrubbing pots, her eyes red from crying. Miss Marple sat with her, offering a handkerchief and a kind word. "You're not in trouble, dear," she said. "But I need to know everything Charles told you," Lily confessed. That Charles had found Silas's letters in the attic months ago, piecing together the brooch's history. He'd planned to sell the lodge, believing the brooch's discovery would drive up its value as a haunted estate. He'd paid Lily. 2 staged ghostly sightings, whispers, flickering lights, a white gown in the halls, to scare Eleanor into agreeing. "I didn't want to," Lily said, "but he said I'd lose my job." Miss Marple patted her hand, assuring her she'd done the right thing by confessing. Lily's story confirmed Charles's greed, but also his ignorance of Clara's true fate. He'd been chasing a treasure, not a murder, with the pieces falling into place. Miss Marple prepared to gather the household that evening. She spent the afternoon in her room, drafting a timeline in her notebook. Clara's confrontation with Silas, her fall, Edward's cowardice, Silas's flight, and Charles's modern scheme. The brooch, now in her possession, was the linchpin, its theft sparking a chain of tragedy. She also considered Agnes Thorne, Silas's sister, who deserved to know the truth about her brother and the brooch's return. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. The mystery was nearly solved, but she needed one final confirmation: Edward Vaughn's fate. Had he truly vanished, or was there more to his story? A trip to the village tomorrow would check for any records of his later years, but for now, she'd lay out the truth for Eleanor and the others. As she dressed for dinner, a soft knock came at her door. It was Rose, the housemaid, her face pale. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "I found something in Mr. Charles's room while cleaning. A letter, hidden in a book." She handed over a folded paper, its edges crisp, despite its age. It was a note from Edward to his father, dated a month. After Clara's disappearance, I cannot stay. The guilt is too much. Silas knows, and he'll never let it rest. Miss Marple thanked Rose, her mind racing. Edward had fled not just from grief, but from fear of Silas's accusations. The puzzle was complete. Clara's death was an accident. Silas's guilt had driven him away, and Edward's cowardice had left the truth buried until now. This chapter has woven together the final threads of Clara's tragedy, revealing the tangled motives of love, greed, and fear. With the truth in hand, how will Miss Marple confront the household? Stay tuned for the final unraveling of Greystone Lodge's secrets. Chapter 10. Unraveling the truth. The evening light filtered through the tall windows of the sitting room at Greystone Lodge, casting a golden hue over the assembled group, a stark contrast to the shadows that had plagued the estate for so long. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual armchair, her posture straight but relaxed, her knitting bag at her feet like a faithful companion. Around her, the household had gathered at her request. Lady Eleanor, looking frail but hopeful. Charles, his face a mask of reluctant resignation. Lily, the young maid, fidgeting with her apron. Rose and Mrs. Baxter from the staff, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension. And Mr. Timmins, the gardener, standing awkwardly by the door, his hands clasped tightly. Even Mr. Dobbs, the footman, had joined his gruff demeanor, softened by the tension in the air. Miss Marple had arranged this meeting to lay bare the truth, to reveal every layer of the mystery that had enveloped the lodge, the ghostly appearances, the missing sapphire brooch, and the tragic fate of Clara Grayson. She sipped her tea, allowing the silence to build, knowing that revelations were best delivered with care. Like unraveling a tangled skein of wool, she began with the ghost, the spectral figure in white that had terrorized the lodge. It was no restless spirit, Miss Marple said calmly, her eyes meeting each person's in turn. Our ghost was very much alive, Lily here, dressed in a white gown, moving through the halls at night, whispering and creating illusions of the supernatural. Lily bowed her head, tears welling up. I'm sorry, Lady Eleanor, she whispered. Mr. Charles made me do it. He said it was just a prank, but then it grew into something more. Charles shifted uncomfortably, but Miss Marple held up a hand. Charles orchestrated it all, using the legend of Clara to frighten you, Eleanor, into selling the lodge. He believed there was value in the property, perhaps from hidden treasures, or simply from escaping the family's mounting debts. But his plan went deeper, tied to secrets he uncovered in the attic and the library. Miss Marple pulled Clara's diary from her knitting bag, its leather cover worn by time, and placed it on the table beside the metal box containing the sapphire brooch. This diary, hidden away in the attic, tells the full story of Clara Grayson. She was a young woman in love with Edward Vaughan, set to marry him in 1895. But Clara discovered a dark family secret. The sapphire brooch, prized heirloom, was not rightfully the Graysons'. It had been stolen by her father, Sir Henry, to settle a fraudulent debt with Edward's family, the Vaughans. The true owners were the Thornes, specifically, Silas Thorne's ancestors. Silas, who worked as a gardener here, learned of this and confronted Clara, demanding its return. He was in love with her, you see, but his obsession turned to rage over the injustice done to his family. The room was silent, save for the faint tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice trembling. Clara, ... what happened to her? Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. On the night before her wedding, during a storm, much like the one we endured last night, Clara met Silas in the library. He had pleaded with Edward to help, but he refused. Fearing the scandal, Clara, brave but alone, tried to reason with Silas, according to his own confession. Shared with Mr. Timmins here before his death, a struggle ensued. Clara attempted to escape through the library window, perhaps to call for help, but in the wind and rain, she slipped and fell to her death on the rocks below. Silas, horrified, didn't mean to harm her. It was an accident born of desperation. He panicked, hid the brooch under the old oak in the garden, and fled the village, leaving. Behind rumors of suicide or elopement, Mr. Timmons spoke up, his voice rough with emotion. Uncle Silas told me on his deathbed. He regretted it every day, but he couldn't come back. The guilt ate him. I kept quiet, out of family loyalty, until Charles started poking around. I tried to stop him, but ... double quotes, Miss Marple interjected gently. You confronted him last night, yes? But let's not forget Charles's role. He found Silas's letters in the attic, pieced together the brooch's history, and saw an opportunity. Facing debts of his own, he stole the brooch from your room, Eleanor, and buried it under the oak, mimicking Silas's actions. Then, he used Lily to stage the ghost sightings doors, slamming whispers in the night, flickers of white to convince. The lodge was haunted and unsellable, unless disposed of quickly. He planned to discover the brooch later, perhaps sell it, or use it to inflate the property's value as a notorious haunted estate. Charles finally spoke, his defiance crumbling. Didn't know about the death accident. It was just an old theft, a way to get ahead. The lodge is bleeding money, Aunt Eleanor. I was trying to save us. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. By lying? By scaring me half to death? Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on her friend's arm. Greed clouds judgment, but it's not too late for amends. The brooch belongs to Agnes Thorne, Silas's sister, still living in the village. Turning it to her will right an old wrong. As for Edward Vaughan, he fled out of cowardice and guilt, knowing he'd abandoned Clara. Records show he lived quietly abroad, never marrying, haunted by his own ghosts, until his death. Miss Marple turned to the staff, addressing the smaller mysteries. Rose, your sightings of lights in the east wing were Charles searching the library and attic. Mrs. Baxter. The whispers Lily mentioned were part of the ruse amplified through old vents. Dobbs, your skepticism was well placed, but even you heard footsteps Charles's as he moved about at night. And the fresh scratches on the locked box in the hidden room? Charles's attempts to uncover more clues, though he didn't know. About Clara's diary until now. She opened the diary to a marked page, reading aloud. Silas's eyes burned with fury, but I saw pain too. The brooch has cursed us all. Closing it, she said, the curse was human, Fall agreed. Love, unreturned, fear. No supernatural force, just people making terrible choices. Eleanor stood wiping her eyes. What now, Jane? The lodge... Miss Marple smiled softly. Cleanse it with truth. Turn the brooch to Agnes. Settle any remaining debts honorably. Charles can help rebuild, perhaps by finding honest work. The ghost is banished, the brooch restored, Clara's memory honored. Greystone Lodge can be a home again, not a house of secrets. The group murmured in agreement, the tension easing like the lifting of a fog. Timmons nodded solemnly. Lily apologized again, and even Charles offered a quiet, I'll make it right. As the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple packed her bag, her work done. She'd write to Agnes, ensure the brooch's return, and perhaps visit Clara's memorial one last time, leaving a flower of her own. Mysteries, she knew, were like gardens weeds pulled, seeds planted, beauty restored. Greystone Lodge would bloom again, and that wraps up our chilling adventure with Miss Marple at Greystone Lodge, where ghosts turned out to be all too human. If you enjoyed this tale of mystery and revelation, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories, and comment below what was your favorite twist. Thanks for watching.